Curly Howard's mystery is finally solved, and the truth is far darker than the laughter he gifted to the world. For generations, Curly has been adored as the most beloved member of the Three Stooges, a whirlwind of innocence, chaos, perfect timing, and irresistible charm. His childlike wonder, his joyous grin, and the unforgettable Nyack became part of America's comedic identity. Audiences saw a man who seemed made of rubber and bliss, a performer who could fall, tumble, collide, and recover with limitless energy. But behind that carefully cultivated image lived a tragic reality that Columbia Pictures worked relentlessly to hide. What we reveal today reshapes everything we thought we knew about Curly Howard. The story behind the camera was not slapstick but heartbreak. From hidden illnesses to crushing pressure, from undiagnosed mental turmoil to the alcoholism that helped destroy him, Curly's true life bore almost no resemblance to the carefree clown he played. And perhaps most painful of all is how thoroughly the truth was buried, preserving a false narrative that still lingers whenever a classic Stooge short flickers across the screen. What follows will change forever the way those routines look. The pratfalls, the spins, the squeals, once you understand what was happening to the man performing them. Curly Howard's public persona and private suffering form one of Hollywood's most successful long-term deceptions. Audiences saw a man who looked indestructible, performing astonishing physical stunts and throwing his body into comedy with abandon. But behind the scenes, he was deteriorating physically and emotionally at a pace that horrified the few who truly noticed. Columbia Pictures understood exactly how valuable Curly was. They also understood that acknowledging his health problems or easing his workload would cut into profits. So they hid everything behind the walls of the studio, behind editing tricks, behind silence. They built a facade so convincing that the world believed Curly was just as unstoppable as the character he played. To understand the truth, we must step into the 5 hidden aspects of Curly Howard's life, each one revealing a deeper level of tragedy. Most people remember Curly's devastating 1946 stroke as the moment his health fell apart. But the truth is that his decline began more than a decade earlier. As early as the mid-1930s, when Curly should have been in the height of youthful strength, his body was already giving out. He suffered from dangerously high blood pressure at a time when treatment was primitive. His weight rose and fell dramatically as he jumped between crash diets and studio-ordered routines. He endured chronic fatigue so severe he sometimes struggled to walk between takes. These were not minor irritations. They were signs of serious illness. Yet Curly received almost none of the rest or medical care he desperately needed. Hollywood lights were brutally hot in those days, and crew members later recalled how Curly would sweat so heavily he sometimes appeared on the verge of collapse. After performing a demanding stunt, he often had to sit down immediately, fighting for breath while makeup artists desperately tried to make him look camera-ready again. Even his iconic rapid-fire voice began to show subtle slurring long before the world suspected anything was wrong. The unbroken energy that defined his character required increasingly long pauses to recover. The studio saw every warning sign. They simply chose not to care. Columbia Pictures had locked the Stooges into a punishing production schedule of 8 shorts per year, a schedule designed to generate maximum profit, not to protect its actors. Curly was the golden goose, the clown who guaranteed laughs. If he needed a moment to pull himself together, filming paused for a moment, but only a moment. Nothing was done to address the cause. One camera operator later said, "The man who did backflips on screen could barely walk between takes." That chilling statement exposes the gap between the illusion and the reality. The deterioration only accelerated in the early 1940s, even as the Stooges produced some of their most beloved classics. Watch their shorts in chronological order and the changes in Curly become painfully visible. The movements slightly slower, the reactions a beat behind, the sparkle in his eyes flickering. Directors began adjusting routines around his limitations, using more reaction shots from Moe and Larry and fewer extended sequences requiring Curly to carry the scene physically. Yet the public saw none of this. They saw magic. They saw comedy. They saw joy. They did not see the cost. By the time the Stooges made Microphonies in 1945, Curly was already deeply ill, yet he somehow delivered one of the greatest performances of his life. It's painful to realize how much of his brilliance was performed through physical misery. Columbia Pictures continued pushing him until the very edge, and that edge arrived in 1946. Curly was only 42 years old, shockingly young, when the stroke that ended his career struck during the filming of Half-Wit's Holiday. He had already been showing troubling symptoms for weeks: exhaustion, confusion, slurred speech. On the day it happened, he was resting quietly when other cast members noticed one side of his face drooping. His speech deteriorated rapidly. Yet instead of calling for immediate medical help, director Jules White simply worked around him. Scenes that did not require Curly were filmed. The show, as always, had to go on. That moment marked the end of Curly's career. Within hours, he was in a hospital, partially paralyzed and unable to speak clearly. Within days, Columbia Pictures had already brought in Shemp as his replacement. There was no announcement, no statement, no farewell. Curly, the most beloved stooge, vanished silently from the screen. Fans were never told why. One year he was there, the next he was gone. It was as if the studio hoped the public wouldn't notice, or that they simply didn't care if they did. Curly made one heartbreaking cameo in 1947's Hold That Lion, a brief scene where he appears sleeping in a train car. But the Curly in that cameo is not the Curly audiences remembered. His once round face was thinner, his eyes dulled, his movements lethargic. It is bittersweet to watch, a final glimpse of a man who had given everything to his art, even as his body failed him. He was only in his 40s, yet he looked decades older. The studio's treatment of Curly during and after his stroke reflects a deeper cruelty. Columbia never saw him as a person, only as an asset. When he could no longer perform, he was quietly set aside. His health did not trigger concern, only inconvenience. His suffering was not the tragedy, it was the interruption to production. But Curly's physical collapse was only one part of the story. His psychological struggles were equally significant, though far more hidden. Family members and colleagues later described extreme mood swings, periods of bubbly, childlike energy followed by days of profound sadness. Biographers examining his personal letters and private recollections have noted patterns resembling bipolar disorder or severe depression. On some mornings, Curly arrived at the studio bursting with enthusiasm, pulling pranks, singing, joking, and radiating the same delight he showed on screen. Other mornings, he could barely speak. He sat alone. He moved slowly. He avoided eye contact. And yet, on those dark days, he was still expected to transform instantly into the whirlwind the world loved. Mo Howard, being both his brother and co-star, understood better than anyone how difficult this was. In later conversations, Mo admitted that during Curly's lowest moments he often had to coach him through scenes line by line. He encouraged him, cued him, and sometimes carried the performance for him. The burden of maintaining Curly's iconic persona became heavier each year, especially as Curly's emotional instability worsened. Columbia Pictures had no mental health support, no understanding of psychological suffering, and no interest in learning. If Curly showed up, he was expected to perform. If he struggled, it was ignored. If he broke, they patched him just enough to continue. As his psychological condition worsened, Curly increasingly turned to alcohol. Drinking had begun as a way to cope with loneliness and stress, but over time it became a desperate attempt to manage internal storms he could neither explain nor control. Alcohol was both self-medication and slow poison. It dulled the pain, but it accelerated his health collapse. The studio not only noticed his drinking, they tolerated it, as long as he could still work. The combination of alcoholism, psychological turmoil, and physical decline created a devastating spiral from which he never escaped. By the time Curly left the Stooges after his stroke, he was a shell of the man audiences thought they knew. His final years were marked by repeated hospitalizations, deteriorating mobility, and ongoing emotional struggles. He spent time in sanitariums and care facilities, receiving support far too late to reverse the damage. The once vibrant clown who made the world erupt with laughter lived out his last years battling illness, depression, and the aftermath of a life pushed beyond its limits. He died in 1952 at just 48 years old. Curly Howard's life is one of the most tragic stories in Hollywood history. An entertainer who poured every ounce of himself into his craft, only to be consumed by the very industry he made rich. The laughter he created was real for his audiences, but behind it lived a hidden world of pain. The joyful, childlike character he played on screen masked a man struggling under enormous emotional weight. Columbia Pictures profited from his genius while hiding his suffering, preserving an illusion that still deceives fans today. When we watch those classic shorts now, the falls, the spins, the wild eyes, the infectious giggle, they take on a different meaning. We still laugh because Curly was brilliant. But beneath the laughter is a deeper understanding of what it cost him. His routines were not just comedy, they were sacrifices. Curly Howard gave everything he had to make the world laugh. And the world never knew what it cost him until it was far too late. The studio era in which Curly Howard lived and worked was a world without psychologists on payrolls, without wellness programs, and without even the basic acknowledgement that emotional suffering might require support, accommodation, or medical attention. As long as Curly stepped into the lights and delivered the wild, explosive energy audiences adored, his internal state was dismissed as irrelevant. This dark reality was shaped by the pervasive stigma that surrounded mental health in the 1930s and 1940s, a period when psychological struggles were often interpreted as weakness, inconvenience, or personal failing rather than as genuine medical conditions requiring understanding or care. Even if Curly or his family had sought professional help, the psychiatric treatments available at that time were primitive, inconsistent, and in many cases harmful by modern standards. There was limited understanding of mood disorders, barely any framework for conditions like bipolar disorder, and even less compassionate language for what people endured behind closed doors. A formal diagnosis would not necessarily have brought relief, therapy, or meaningful improvement. Instead, it would more likely have resulted in stigma, ineffective treatment, or dismissal. Caught in this environment, Curly was left without guidance or tools to navigate the profound mood disturbances that increasingly shadowed his life. And all the while he was expected to continue performing at a punishing pace, fulfilling the relentless demands of a studio contract that treated exhaustion, despair, and physical decline as irrelevant obstacles to be pushed aside. Without proper diagnosis or support, Curly fell into patterns of self-medication that were tragically common at the time. Alcohol became his refuge, a temporary numbing agent that lifted the weight of his psychological turmoil just enough to allow him to function. But this fleeting relief carried a devastating cost. What began as occasional drinks evolved into a dependency that blended invisibly into the studio culture of the era, a culture where heavy drinking was both tolerated and normalized, especially among performers who needed to unwind after grueling shooting schedules. Yet for Curly, alcohol did not simply blur the edges of stress. It became a coping mechanism for deeper, untreated mental distress. His alcoholism, like his mental health struggles, was carefully hidden from the public, an open secret within the studio walls but a taboo topic outside them. It was one of the most meticulously concealed aspects of his life, maintained by a publicity machine determined to protect the illusion of Curly as a carefree, joyful clown whose on-screen exuberance mirrored his private world. In truth, his drinking escalated dramatically in the late 1930s as the physical demands of Stooges productions increased and his emotional life became ever more turbulent. What began as social drinking after long days of filming gradually transformed into regular consumption, sometimes even before stepping onto the set. Crew members, actors, and even his brother Mo witnessed this shift with growing alarm. But intervention in those days was rare. Studios did not pause production for personal health. They adjusted scenes, rewrote moments, altered physical blocking, and did whatever was necessary to keep the cameras rolling. One crew member later recalled the atmosphere bluntly, saying they let Curly drink himself to death as long as the reels kept turning. This statement, harsh yet heartbreakingly accurate, reveals the cold calculation that governed Columbia Pictures' treatment of Curly. His alcoholism was recognized but never addressed. Instead, it was managed, concealed, and worked around so filming could continue uninterrupted. There were days when Coley arrived visibly intoxicated, his movements slower, his timing uneven, his coordination slightly off. But rather than stopping production, the team adjusted. Mo and Larry covered for him in scenes requiring precision, and Mo, who served not only as the Stooges' leader but also as Coley's protective older brother, sometimes physically positioned Coley for shots. He would guide him into place, steady him, and step away just as the director called action. These compensations kept the shorts on schedule, but they also masked the urgency of Coley's condition. Columbia Pictures saw Coley not as a vulnerable man spiraling into addiction, but as an asset whose weaknesses could be disguised as long as the finished product met audience expectations. Public relations staff polished his image relentlessly. Any absences or troubling behavior were explained away with fabricated stories about minor illnesses or harmless misunderstandings. The joyful, carefree Coley the world adored was a carefully curated illusion, one that hid the painful truth of a performer whose body and mind were slowly yielding to the pressures placed upon him. Alcohol only worsened his pre-existing health issues. His high blood pressure, his weight fluctuations, and the general physical strain of performing violent slapstick comedy day after day. Unchecked, these conditions formed a dangerous combination, creating a perfect storm that made his eventual stroke increasingly inevitable. When that devastating stroke struck in 1946, it marked not just the end of Coley's career but the beginning of a long, painful decline that few outside his inner circle ever fully understood. The public was given a sanitized explanation, a simple announcement that Coley would no longer appear with the Stooges. But behind the scenes, a far more heartbreaking reality unfolded. His final years, rarely discussed, often omitted entirely from official histories, were marked by profound suffering, institutional abandonment, and increasing isolation. After the stroke, Coley struggled through a grueling recovery complicated by the very health issues the studio had ignored for years. He regained partial mobility but remained permanently impaired. His left side weakened, his speech affected, his once limitless comedic energy dimmed by physical limitations he could neither control nor accept. These losses were devastating for a performer whose livelihood depended entirely on sharp timing, physical agility, and expressive movement. Columbia Pictures, which had profited massively from Coley's talent for over a decade, offered little support. Once it became clear he could not return to the set, the studio quietly distanced itself, leaving his care and expenses largely to his family. His savings dwindled quickly, swallowed by medical bills and the costs of daily assistance. Coley, still clinging to hope, believed for a time that he might eventually recover enough to return to performing. But as months stretched into years without significant improvement, the realization sank in, pulling him into periods of deep depression. In 1947, he married Valerie Newman, his third wife, whose presence brought temporary stability. Yet as his condition worsened, the strain of caregiving proved overwhelming, transforming their marriage into a dynamic neither had anticipated nor were prepared to endure. By 1948, a second, more severe stroke dramatically accelerated his decline, marking the beginning of a tragic new chapter. Coley's needs surpassed what his family could manage, and he entered a cycle of institutional care, hospitals, sanitariums, nursing facilities, far removed from the spotlight that had once celebrated him. These institutions, though necessary, were stark, lonely places for a man who had once commanded stage and screen with effortless charm and vitality. His bright, magnetic persona gave way to long periods of confusion, fatigue, and silence. A nursing home attendant later remarked that Coley had given the studio everything and received nothing in return, a painful truth reflected in the life he now lived. The decline that followed his second stroke was profound, affecting not only Coley's physical strength but also his cognitive abilities, speech, and capacity to recognize familiar faces. The sharp comedic instincts that had once made him the heart of the Three Stooges gradually faded beneath the weight of neurological damage. His ability to communicate became inconsistent, his once quick, playful responses replaced by long pauses, fragmented sentences, or moments of confusion. For a man whose life had been built on timing, expression, and the rapid-fire rhythm of slapstick comedy, This loss was devastating. It robbed him not only of his career but also of the identity he had carried so proudly. Mo Howard visited Coley frequently during these years, providing not only emotional support but also financial help drawn from his own earnings. These visits were heartbreaking. Mo, who had known Coley not merely as a colleague but as a beloved younger brother, now watched helplessly as the vibrant, mischievous spirit he loved deteriorated into a frail, quiet figure who sometimes struggled to recognize him. There were moments when Coley's eyes lit up with a flicker of the old warmth, moments when he seemed briefly aware of the bond they once shared. But there were also days when Mo walked into Coley's room only to be met with blankness, a painful reminder of the toll the strokes had taken on Coley's mind. Coley's decline continued steadily, each passing month bringing new limitations. The man who had once commanded laughter with just a gesture or look now struggled to sit upright without assistance. He needed help with basic tasks, his independence slowly surrendering to the growing list of physical impairments. The cheerful chaos he had once brought to millions, those unforgettable spins, shrieks, and playful antics, felt impossibly distant now, lost somewhere between the person he had been and the shadow he had become. In December 1951, tragedy struck again with a massive cerebral hemorrhage that left Coley fully incapacitated. He was transferred to the North Hollywood Hospital and Sanitarium, where he would spend his final weeks bedridden, unresponsive, and surrounded by clinical silence instead of laughter. He remained in that condition until January 1952, passing away at just 48 years old. His death marked the end of a life defined by extraordinary talent, relentless pressure, and a profound absence of the care he deserved. Yet even in death, the truth of Coley's suffering remained largely hidden. Columbia Pictures offered only a brief, sanitized statement, acknowledging his passing but omitting any mention of the studio's role in the years of decline that preceded it. There was no public reflection on the physical demands placed on Coley, no admission of the untreated health issues, and no acknowledgement of the devastating effects of the stroke. Instead, the studio maintained the illusion that Coley had slipped quietly into retirement long before his death, protecting its own reputation while allowing the full weight of Coley's tragedy to fade from public view. This sanitized version of Coley's final years would persist in popular memory for decades. Fans continued to celebrate the golden age of the Three Stooges without confronting the darker reality that had unfolded behind the scenes. For many, Coley remained frozen in time as the energetic whirlwind who delighted audiences with his infectious laughter and comedic brilliance. Only by examining the truth of his decline can we understand the full cost of the entertainment system that shaped and ultimately broke him. When we integrate all 5 hidden aspects of Coley Howard's story, a deeply troubling picture emerges. His experience was not merely one of personal misfortune or isolated tragedy, but of systemic exploitation rooted in an era of Hollywood that prioritized profit over humanity. Coley was not simply a comedian who fell ill. He was a vulnerable man pushed beyond his limits by a studio system that valued his output more than his well-being. His health issues were ignored, his mental struggles dismissed, and his addiction enabled because he remained a valuable commodity as long as he could perform. Even as his body began to fail, the studio found ways to work around his limitations rather than address them. And once his performance could no longer be extracted, he was cast aside. The early signs of serious health issues, stroke risk factors, weight fluctuations, high blood pressure, should have prompted concern. Instead, they were treated as inconveniences to be managed quietly. His mental health struggles, likely stemming from untreated mood disorders, were brushed aside in an era when psychological suffering was misunderstood or stigmatized. His alcoholism, which grew visibly worse, was left to spiral into a destructive force that further jeopardized his health. In the end, these compounding issues made his collapse not only predictable but almost inevitable. What makes Coley's story especially tragic is the way his suffering remained invisible to the audience. They saw only the joyful, chaotic performer who bounded across the screen with infectious energy. They did not see the man behind the scenes trying to steady his hands before filming, struggling with internal storms, or masking pain with alcohol. They did not see the pressure he carried, the exhaustion etched into his features, or the fear that his body was failing him long before the public ever knew. The laughter he created, laughter that still echoes through generations, came at an immense personal cost. The truth of Coley Howard's life forces us to reconsider how we view those beloved Three Stooges shorts. Behind the uproarious comedy was a man enduring physical strain, emotional turmoil, and a system that cared only for the performance he could provide. His brilliance was undeniable, but so was the exploitation that fueled it. Acknowledging that reality does not diminish his legacy. Rather, it deepens our understanding of the extraordinary resilience he demonstrated. Despite the immense challenges he faced, Coley continued to bring joy to millions, performing with a level of commitment that remains unmatched. In the end, Coley Howard was far more than the comic genius immortalized on film. He was a sensitive, generous, loving man who deserved far better than what the studio system gave him. He deserved support, compassion, and recognition not only for his talent but for his humanity. His life serves as a stark reminder of the hidden cost of entertainment in an era when performers were treated as expendable resources rather than individuals worthy of care. And so, the next time you hear that familiar "nuck, nuck, nuck," remember the real Coley, the man behind the laughter, the man whose brilliance masked deep suffering, the man who gave everything he had until there was nothing left to give.